Well, hello, here we are again. It's been a couple of weeks and we're going to resume our three-part series on the refinishing of this vintage Remington hammer gun. The primary purpose was to repair the broken stock head and at the same time partially refinish the buttstock without going to the extent of totally refinishing it. We wanted to preserve its original appearance and patina, and that's taken about 2 weeks, and I'll explain why. In the meanwhile, we've disassembled and cleaned the action and all of its internal parts, including the lock work, the triggers and the trigger bow, and we've made some interesting discoveries in the process of doing that. The first thing that struck me as odd when I took this action down was the serial numbers. On the action here is marked the number 2500, and several of the working parts bear that same number. For example, that's 2600. For example, the characteristic lifter lever has that number on it. The number is stamped on the back of the action, and so on. However, curiously, the barrels, which I don't have here, bear the number 72, and that struck me as odd. And now on the triggers, a number 4326 appears on the bottom metal on the trigger plate here, and that initially led me to believe that somebody at some point had replaced this entire assembly, because that same number appears on the trigger blades themselves from another gun. However, also on this trigger plate is the number 72, so that would be too much of a coincidence to be true, and so I believe that these numbers were all marked this way at the factory. When we cleaned up the stock and I was oiling it, and I had it out in the sun because that's the best way to get the linseed oil to dry quickly. The UV causes it to set up, and you really have to get it to dry before you put subsequent coats on. I noticed a very fine line that follows this path on both sides of the action, and on a closer inspection it appears that this entire pistol grip has been spliced into this stock, and it's been done so professionally that one has to really look at it closely to see those lines. And there's a vestige of the cutout for the original straight grip trigger tang right here. So this stock was originally a straight grip with a straight trigger tang. It was subsequently modified to take to a pistol grip stock, and it required obviously a different trigger tang to do that. And I believe all of that was done at the factory. I don't see how that could have been done anywhere else because of the presence of the number 72 both on the barrel and on this part here. And that was a very curious and interesting discovery that I made. It was beautifully done. You know, the original checkering is present, and it disguises the splice here and the cutout for the trigger tang, and that I think solved that particular mystery. We had to do some minor repairs to the action. One of the springs for the hammers for the firing pins was weak, so I replaced one of the springs. I had them apart anyway. I actually discovered a slight crack right in the root of the trigger bow here, and we TIG welded that up and didn't refinish it. We just worked it down and applied a little bit of secret medicine to restore the patina, and we wanted to preserve as much of the original finish as possible. So we had to replace, or we had to repair the trigger. In addition, while we were at it, we put a plug into the stock here where this top tank screw is. It's a wood screw, and the hole had been stripped out, and that's very common on vintage guns because you do get some a tendency for the wood to rot. And in fact, in this case, the screw was actually broken, which surprised me. And I drilled that dowel that I put in there. I drilled that dowel about 2/3 of the way through the grip. So I cut through that splice that I mentioned. So that will reinforce the work that was done so many years ago to splice in this beautiful Prince of Wales grip. And in doing so, I actually discovered that there is a metal pin that goes all the way through. So whoever did that work, two wise minds think alike, put a metal pin through the same screw hole that the top tank wood screw goes through into the new wood to hold everything together, and it's held up extremely well over the years. The repair itself, just to critique my own work, could have been better. The color of the epoxy was a little lighter than it should have been, so you can still see on either side, you can still see the epoxy line. And had I made the epoxy darker, that would have disappeared, although not altogether. It would have been less noticeable. The rest of it came out pretty much how I had hoped. As I say, I did not strip off any of the original finish other than to clean the gun, to clean the wood. I wanted to preserve as much of the original patina as possible. And you know, had I done so, it would have been a more uniform color, but I think it's pleasing and original looking. It looks like a gun that's been well cared for, not like a gun that has been restored. So what we're going to do today is reassemble the gun, and then we'll be done with our project. I've got all the parts here in the jar where I left them. I haven't done much to any of them other than to clean them and lube them. I'll first reinstall the original sling stud. That's the easy part. We now have to do our screwdriver work. I had to make a new screw for this top tang here, because the original screw, as I mentioned, was actually broken off, and there it is. The original screw broke off, and I had to drill out the remaining piece of it when I put the dowel in, and I replaced it with this screw, and I engraved the head to try to make it look the same as the original one. And it's not all shiny and new, it's been dulled. Again, we don't want to make this look like a gun that's had a total restoration. That's kind of a no-no in many people's eyes. And that's also a no-no, is dropping stuff on the ground. Because you can spend an incredible amount of time looking for things that you drop on the floor. These small parts have a way of disappearing. I used to tell my kid there's a bolt monster living underneath my workbench here, because I will sometimes drop an item and never ever find it again. And with screws in particular, these custom screws, you can't just order a new one, you've got to make one, and that is a whole lot of work. Okay, so let's reassemble. I have lubed the action, so there's no need to do that. I put some grease in some of the high friction parts, and then just regular oil, fine machine oil, or I use this silicone one lube because it doesn't freeze up in cold weather. And the first thing we do is we just place the action back on the head. It's when a stock cracks like this, there's usually a reason, and that reason is usually poor inletting by whoever originally inlet the stock. However, in this case, I think it was just a question of firing a lot of heavy 10 gauge loads, because I don't see any sign of, you know, gaps and what have you. The fit seems to be pretty good. It might be a little bit bearing a little bit too much on the upper part of the stock head here, and I'm just going to clean that up, trying to keep it as flat as possible. There's a little bit of epoxy that's seeped down to the repairs here that's proud. So anyway, the important point is, if a stock does crack, repairing it is not going to solve the problem if the problem was poor inletting to begin with. So one should keep an eye out for those kinds of things and improve the inletting if necessary. Okay, I will now put the trigger plate in place, and I'm going to gently replace the screws. I'm not going to tighten them down yet, making sure I've got a screwdriver that fits. And one has to be careful, because some of these screws, like this one for example, there are two identical screws in this gun, and if you put the wrong one in the wrong hole, it's not going to line up north-south. It's not going to, the screw slots are not going to be timed, as we say. So make sure you put the right screw in the right hole. Sometimes that's if you're diligent about it, you can mark them somehow, and some guns actually have them marked by the person that originally made them. Okay. Generally speaking, screws that are, in vintage guns like this, screws that are exposed have engraved heads, and screws that are not exposed have plain heads. But that's not always true, because some of the better quality guns, some of the better quality gun makers engrave their unexposed screw heads as well. Nothing looks worse than a gun with messed up screw heads, so again, it's important to take a little bit of care in replacing the screws, and that amounts, or that equates to picking a screwdriver that fits the screw slot, and not just using any old hardware store screwdriver. And then making sure you don't be limp-wristed about it. You want to sometimes it's necessary to seat the action firmly on the, so the trigger bow just rotates into place, and then you can that's the screw I had in the wrong slot previously. Then you can once it's made its last rotation, you can screw down the tang, checking to see that it shows through on the top end without you know, excessively penetrating there. Alright, so we've nearly got the action in place. I want to drill the hole in the dowel for where I made the repair, and that is a little tricky. You want to get the hole in the middle, obviously, and You want to make the first portion of the hole a little bit bigger in diameter than the remainder of the hole, and you need to pick a drill which is obviously equal to the minor diameter of the threads, or a little bit less, so you don't strip the hole again. So I've done that here, and in terms of angle, you want to go in at about right angles to the metal. And you want to go in deep enough so that your screw will bottom out. Alright, put that aside. Well, this is not the most exciting video. Watching somebody screwing screws into an vintage gun is not as exciting as perhaps other forms of screwing. But we're not doing that today. Alright, so now we have to replace the top lever screw, which is an interesting one. There are actually two screws. There's one that goes in through the top lever, because you can't move the top lever to the side out of the way on this action. You can only move it up and down. So they thoughtfully made a hole in it, in the top lever, for your main screw, and then they made a little plug which is engraved to cover that up, which goes into the actual top lever. It covers up the hole that was drilled to provide access to the screw which is underneath it, the action screw. That's kind of a unique feature. All that remains to be done now is to replace the lock work, and there's nothing really magical about that. One has to move the triggers out of the way, move them forward, otherwise they'll interfere with the sear here, or the tail of the sear, where the trigger basically pushes up there to release the, there I have the trigger, the hammer cocked, and I push up there. That sear right by my thumb there, my left thumb, releases the hammer into its fully forward position, and there's your half cock position, which enables you to open and close the gun without the firing pin dragging on the cartridge primer. So just always move the triggers well forward. The other thing that's important is that the inletting, you may need to move the, if the firing pin is spring loaded, you may need to either cock the hammer or depress the firing pin to get the hammer to move into its normal position. And I'm going to do the same now with the left hand side lock, and you'll notice I've removed the hammer. That is to get access to a screw I need to put through there before I tighten everything down. This lock plate screw is actually behind the hammer, and one has to remove the hammer. That's very unusual on a hammer gun. You have to remove the hammer in order to get access to this screw that holds the lock plates in place on both sides. It goes all the way through. But you know, that's what makes old guns interesting. They're all unique in their construction and mechanism and the workmanship. And you'd think that someone would have thought of that, but perhaps that was intentional, because it it hides that screw. So there we go. Our gun is together. Here are the barrels, and there's the serial number I was referring to, 72 on the barrels, which tells me that this gun was made with non-matching numbers. This lump is a very unusual mechanism. It's a split lump with a notch, and it has this rotating hook here in the front lump, which is part of the lifter mechanism. Rather than the usual double underlug, it has a piston or a rod that engages engages these lumps. It's machined to engage these lumps, which is a little unusual. And it actually makes it rather difficult to assemble unless you know the trick. So there we have the gun assembled. As you notice, I'm putting grease on some critical areas here. One is the hook of the barrel, which engages the hinge pin. And I mentioned earlier that this gun is very tight. Well, the reason for that is I'll show you in a second. On an older gun like this, the hinge pins do get worn down, but just by they don't shoot loose. People say the guns shoot loose. That's not what happens. By opening and closing the gun, you wear the wear surface on the hinge pin and the hinge pin itself, and that causes it to be loose, and that is accelerated or exacerbated by the lack of grease or oil. People don't understand that you have to apply grease to those points. So the gun's nice and tight, and the reason for that is another thing I discovered when I cleaned things up. This hinge pin has actually been replaced at one time. This engraving should actually disguise the hinge pin and be carried over onto the hinge pin, and it's not. The hinge pin is new metal, and it hasn't been engraved, and it hasn't been very well contoured either. So that was done by somebody a long time ago, and all of that tells me this gun was used quite a bit. It was used enough that the stock was damaged and the hinge pin was worn out, but we've now got her back to working condition, with a couple of caveats. One is, on a vintage gun, the stock head is always the weak point. People say, oh, Damascus barrels are dangerous. Actually, the Damascus barrel would take a lot of pounding, and is far stronger than it needs to be for even a modern smokeless shell, if it's in sound condition, if it hasn't been damaged by pitting or reamed out to make it too thin. What does give is the stock head. And that's also partly because people use steel butt plates a lot on vintage guns. They didn't have fancy ventilated pads or rubber pads in those days. And what that does is it subjects the stock head to a lot more pounding than would be the case if there were a pad on the gun. So 2 tips. One is use a slip-on pad if you want to preserve the original butt plate. Of course, that's a good idea. Don't be taking off original butt plates. That's a no-no. But use a slip-on pad, and that'll save the stock quite a bit. And the other thing is, of course, especially on a 10 gauge, there's no need to be loading up heavy loads in these old guns. And by heavy, I mean I'm referring to the amount of shot in the cartridge. Stick with lighter loads. In a 12 gauge, 1 ounce is plenty. In a 10 gauge, you might go to 1 ounce and 3/8 or 1.5 ounces or something like that. But there's no need to be loading up, super heavy duck loads in these old guns. You're just going to subject the stock head to a lot of abuse, and you may crack it if it hasn't been cracked, or you may crack it again if it's been cracked and repaired. So there we have it. Our project is complete.